Hello, hello, my friends, my fellow clayheads out there. Uh, I'm back. I'm ready to roll. Today is, let's see, Saturday the 14th, Pi Day, as they say, as my father-in-law sent in our family group chat. Uh, you know, all hail Pi, favorite constant of the universe, I guess. I'm sure Planck's constant is feeling real jealous right now. So today, I mean, for people unaware, if you're just first time tuning in or whatever, weekends I don't usually do news commentary. I like to take a little time to kind of relax and do some other stuff. So if it's usually like an educational sort of stream where I listen to videos related to like history and I try to learn something, and I hope you guys try to learn something while I add some commentary. I think that's obviously not everybody's thing, so if you just want the news commentary, it'll be back on Monday. Let's see. So, personal news yesterday after I streamed, I played or I watched some Stargate, played some more World of Warcraft. Um, I started trying to play like a Final Fantasy 3 remake from Steam because the Square Enix sale was going on and it was only like $6. But I didn't really make it that far. I don't know if I'll go back to it. Maybe I will. I do at some point want to play through all of the older Final Fantasies, which I've honestly have not. I basically started around Final Fantasy 9 as a kid, and then I went back and played Final Fantasy 7 and I think Final Fantasy 6. Although I might not have finished Final Fantasy 6, and then I kind of stopped around. I guess 11 technically, but that was the online one. But I never beat 12 either, so that was kind of when I fell off. So I wanna go back and play some more of those at some point, but I don't know if this time it'll catch me or not. This morning I did some work in our yard. I just pulled some weeds basically and swept up some uh, just some stuff, and that's pretty much all I did. And then me and my wife went to Dunkin' Donuts so she could get the sugariest of sugary coffee drinks, which she loves and I do not. So I'm a black coffee kind of guy. Um, anyway, that's it for the personal news. Today is we're going to be learning from our good friends over at Red Pen about the Russian Revolution after October. Russian Revolution, I've read some about, but I don't really feel like I have that full of an understanding. So I'm trying to learn a little bit more. So that's what we're going to be watching today. And then the bottom right of my screen or of the stream, you'll see I'm playing World of Warcraft. I gotta do something to. I can't do just one thing. I guess I gotta be doing something else at the same time. So if that helps you to look at the pretty colors or whatever, more power to you. We're trying to get as many people educated here as possible. So, that all being said, I'm just going to launch right into this video. I'll add commentary as I see fit, but let's all learn something together. It's so peaceful.
The Russian Revolution was a turning point in world history and has been cited by many historians as the most significant series of events of the 20th century. The revolution may be thought of as both a consequence and a cause in the decline of capitalism, posing a direct challenge to the capitalist order from within the capitalist world system itself. It marked the first historic example of workers and peasants capturing and maintaining state power, as it openly set out to define a socialist future, not only for Russia, but the entire world. The early stages of the revolution saw great achievements as well as many setbacks, as Russia transformed from a peasant society into an industrial power and fought to sustain itself in a world hostile to its vision for the future.
That world still exists, by the way. Capitalism is very much hostile to the concept of socialism to this day.
Whether Soviet society was socialist or not is highly contested, but what is undeniably true is that it represented an attempt to move the world beyond the capitalist system. It advanced an alternative vision and mode of organizing society that inspired many changes across the world. The
Yeah.
Russian Revolution, like the French Revolution before it, continues to live in the hopes and aspirations for a better future.
Hey, one day, baby. One day we'll get there.
Tsar Nicholas II ascended the Russian throne in 1894 during a time of rapid social transformation induced by the new capitalist world system, as terrorist plots, a starving peasantry, and repeated military failures continued to deepen the crisis into the 20th century. By 1905, social disorganization and conflict gave rise to the First Russian Revolution, an uncoordinated, spontaneous revolt of liberal constitutionalists, workers, and peasants, all opposed to the antiquated monarchy. The uprising was violently repressed as Tsarist police opened fire on the crowd, killing hundreds of protesters. It was a brutal act of repression that severely damaged the Tsar's already tarnished reputation. The Tsar attempted to quell the insurrection through a series of reforms, but these reforms were completely insignificant to most of the demonstrators, including the Petersburg Soviet Workers' Deputies, a newly established organization of workers from the city. The Petersburg Soviets were local syndicates that helped the workers form trade unions and wage militant struggle. For nearly 12 years, the Soviets would continue to agitate and organize workers into a political force capable of contending for power. That is, until February 1917, when another mass uprising erupted against food rationing and calls for the Tsar to step down.
Yeah.
The
Hey, the food insecurity. It always seems to preface the any sort of like struggle for liberation. Or like struggle for revolution. I always think also back to the French Revolution where the bread shortages and stuff like really got people pissed at the monarchy. And this was also this was they said late 1800 or mid 1800s. So I guess this was pretty far after the French Revolution, but yeah.
insurrectionary forces, including the Petersburg Soviets, had won the support of much of the police and military, and after 8 days of skirmishes with the last remaining loyalist forces, the Tsar was finally forced to abdicate his throne. As the Tsar stepped down, the power void was filled by the provisional government, comprised of liberal and Republican factions from the
Uh-oh.
scant bourgeois
Uh-oh. Liberals and Republicans. What could go wrong?
class. The provisional government took over official power, but was forced into a dual power struggle with the Petrograd Soviets, who remained committed to the urban proletariat. Later that year, social instability and new political circumstances brought a flood of revolutionaries back to Petrograd from exile. The majority of these radicals were associated either with the Menshevik or the Bolsheviks of the Social Democratic Workers' Party. Among the Bolshevik Party was Lenin, whose return to Petrograd was
Lenin.
followed by a dramatic call for zero compromise with the provisional government, brandishing the slogan, "All power to the Soviets." Lenin's slogan was based on his unpopular position articulated in his April
Kind of a, I mean, no offense to Lennon here, but kind of a funny looking dude, if I had to say. Um, but I guess I feel like the revolutionaries always tend to be like a little bit funny looking. Sometimes they're really hot though, but usually I think they're all a little bit funny looking.
theses, where he argued against the orthodox Marxist
Oh,
position
there he is,
that
Daddy.
suggested it was necessary for international socialist revolution to begin first in the most advanced capitalist countries. Marx argued that it was necessary for backward feudal countries to pass through capitalism as a necessary historical stage of development towards socialism.
This is something I completely agree with, by the way. I don't think that you can leapfrog straight from like monarchy and feudalism into socialism. I just don't think it's possible. Primarily, my thoughts are that it depends so heavily on the the productive capabilities of the country, and if you're not really industrialized and you're not really like able to produce at significant quantities and able to like monitor and track that production in like a relatively sophisticated way, then there's going to be, lots of problems that show up that are not necessarily um, you know, doable. And honestly, I don't even think it's straight from capitalism to socialism either. I think you got to go through capitalism, then through state capitalism, like what China has, and then finally, maybe there's socialism at the end of the tunnel. Um, I don't know everything about Marx though. I don't know if my thoughts on this. I've read I read, the Communist Manifesto and Capital Volume 1 or whatever. That's about all of his stuff that I've actually read. Everything else is what I've picked up from like, YouTube videos and his history and stuff. So I don't know how far my thoughts deviate from traditional Marxist like analysis or whatever.
Russian Marxists generally held to this position and interpreted the revolutionary events in backward Russia as giving rise to a bourgeois society, not a socialist one. But Lenin rejected this view and instead argued that socialist revolution was indeed occurring in Russia first, not because it was more advanced than Europe, but precisely because it was so heavily exploited and underdeveloped by imperialism. If Lenin was correct, this meant that the February Revolution, which gave power to the bourgeois class in the form of the provisional government, was not the final stage of revolution. Through Lenin's April theses, it became possible to see how an underdeveloped economy like Russia could still demonstrate the potential for socialist revolution. In October that year, shortly after a failed takeover by a right-wing general, Lenin thought the time for action had finally arrived, and orchestrated a coup d'etat with the Soviet Revolutionary Military Committee. As a full-scale uprising erupted in St. Petersburg, a fleet of Bolshevik sailors entered the Petrograd harbor, and tens of thousands of soldiers rose up in support of the Bolsheviks. Trotsky, who had only recently joined the Bolsheviks a few months prior, played a leading role in the operation. He led the advance of the Red Guard, a small workers' and peasants' militia, on the Winter Palace and key positions in the city. The provisional government collapsed and the prime minister fled abroad. It was
this, by the way, is what a lot of the ultras on the left and stuff, how they envision the revolution and the socialist revolution in America going. I'm not so sure personally.
a bloodless coup.
But I'm never gonna knock them if they can get a revolutionary vanguard to go and coup the American state. Like, more power to them. Best of luck. I just don't necessarily think that's the route it's gonna happen in America.
The Bolsheviks transferred all power from the provisional government to the Soviets, announced Russia's withdrawal from World War I, and declared the abolition of landed property. These decrees were immediately felt across the world. Capitalist nations everywhere took pause at the events unfolding in Russia. Not only did a group of rabble-rousers and criminals successfully capture state...
Rabble-rousers is what I like to call the press. Whenever the press all yell at the person they're trying to ask a question to, I call them rabble-rousers.
Power, but were abolishing private property and urging workers of the world to do the same.
Yeah, that
Former
terrified
allies,
the shit out of
particularly
them.
the British, were deeply shaken by Russia's sudden disloyalty as it pulled from the war effort. It was an affront to the international power of capital that could not go unpunished.
Yep. By the way, that sort of stuff, like capitalism has never let a socialist or attempted socialist country ever just kind of like live or exist. Like even to this day, we're still fucking with Cuba as they're like one of the few who are still trying to maintain it or whatever. I guess like Vietnam to an extent we've kind of stopped fucking with after we tried and failed to destroy their communist party or whatever. But yeah, and I don't know. One day America will be so bogged down with everything that like they won't have any way to prevent like to monitor and constantly coup all of these like socialist countries that are trying stuff. Unfortunately though, there's also like global capitalism, which is outside the scope of America that it might find ways, but uh, the revolutionary spirit is strong. I'm sure, like in the human psyche and the human condition. So I believe that one day they'll dismantle that global capitalist system. I just don't know if it'll be in my lifetime or not.
At the initial stages of revolution, hardly anyone in the West believed that the Bolsheviks could maintain a workers' government for more than even a few weeks. The party had a weak grasp on the vast Russian territory, and there was widespread disloyalty among the workers and soldiers. Chaos and criminality ensued. Workers plundered the workplace, soldiers held mutinies against officers, transport broke down, and bureaucrats were appointed to positions which they were unqualified to fill. Not everyone was on board with the Bolshevik vision for Russia, but as time passed and the Bolsheviks became more deeply embedded and widely recognized as the legitimate government of Russia, fear and apprehension began to take over Western allies.
Yep, the Red Scare. Here we go, baby.
In the spring of 1918, the
They
Russians...
probably they might not get that into that because that's all like stuff that's happening in America during this. I bet Red Pen has a video on the Red Scare that maybe we'll watch someday. But yeah, capitalists were freaking out back then,
Civil War began as
having a hissy
American,
fit.
British, French, and Japanese forces formed the White Armies and invaded Russia with the goal of overthrowing the Bolshevik government. The Western invaders, seeking to halt the socialist revolution, worked in tangent with Tsarist loyalists,
See, this is one of those things like why, right? Like why? Why are they going in there? Why are they risking life and limb to stop a like internal revolution that is attempting to change the character of this one country? It's not trying to necessarily expand or anything, like at least not at this point. Why are these capitalist countries or whatever coming in and like trying to do this, like uh I mean, it's very clear that capitalism like has a distinct fear of socialism, like a petrifying fear of it, and one must ask the question why.
and anti-Bolshevik radicals such as the Mensheviks. Terms like Red Terror and White Terror came to dominate political vocabulary
White
as
terror.
violent scenes became frequent,
That was my
with
nickname in high
gunfights,
school.
assassinations, and indiscriminate killings breaking out across the country. In the summer, Lenin was shot in Moscow, and 2 other prominent Bolsheviks were assassinated in Petrograd. For 6 months, the Bolshevik regime was hanging by a thread, and the Civil War could have completely severed it and reversed all the gains of the revolution if it weren't for the success of the Bolshevik economic and military strategy. Trotsky was appointed People's Commissar for War and had already proven himself an effective military strategist during the October Revolution. He was largely responsible for the growth of the military forces and establishment of the Red Army. To grow the strength and sophistication of the Red Guard and transform it into a trained army, Trotsky found it necessary to recruit former soldiers and officers of the Tsarist regime and conscript them into key positions of the Red Army. The Red Guard, which mustered barely 10,000 trained men in 1917, became the Red Army, boasting 5 million men at its founding on February 23,
That's a lot of people.
1918. Trotsky understood that although there may be dissident forces within the Red Army ranks, defense of the revolution required the skills and knowledge that Russia currently had at its disposal. Drastic economic measures were also introduced to meet the extraordinary challenges in defending the revolution. The White Armies constantly mobilized against the Red Army, which remained in severe need of material support.
Man, that's quite the like propaganda poster, man. That's another thing that I love is propaganda posters of the past. I just think they're so cool, such an interesting relic.
To meet these needs, the regime centralized control over the economy and nationalized key industries. The series of reforms that ushered in these dramatic changes would become known as war communism.
War communism.
Keeping the Red Army supplied and the population fed was paramount to the ends of war communism, but increased grain collections proved harder in theory than in practice. The earlier policy of abolishing landed property allowed peasants to seize and redistribute land among themselves and proved effective in reducing the size of large landowners. but the spontaneous redistribution of land led to a mass of self sufficient peasant farms that produced very small surpluses, making it nearly impossible to supply the Red Army or feed the cities.
Hmm.
War Communism responded with a harsh policy of grain requisitioning from the countryside. The regime established food detachments to collect grain from petty bourgeois landowners known as kulaks, who were thought to be hoarding large quantities. The term kulak intended to identify a class position in the countryside, but quickly evolved into a term of abuse used as a political tool to encompass middle or even lower class elements of the peasantry. This was largely because these middle and lower layers of the peasantry were far more difficult to organize than what was previously thought. Rather than siding with the government policy to remove the kulak, these poor peasants often sided with the kulak against the government. The
Interesting.
poor peasant may have been oppressed by the kulak, but an oppression that was close to him was preferred over the oppression by a distant power.
That's interesting. That's not that dissimilar to a lot of a lot of hogs always like siding with the government to come like I don't know, brutalize their neighbors and stuff or whatever and surveil them or whatever. I don't know. Or yeah, I don't know. It's like there's something in human nature like that like they well, I guess that's a little bit different. That's like the federal government coming in, but maybe it's just the sense of having some sort of authority to some nearby authority to like hold on to yeah, I don't know. That's interesting.
Towards the end of
Sorry, I'm still trying to process that sort of like into like modern historical context. I don't know. I probably didn't really even say anything there.
1918, the white invaders started to realize that they had underestimated both the power of their Soviet adversaries as well as the willingness to fight among their own troops. Not only were the American and European soldiers fatigued from the battles of World War I, but a significant number within the ranks sympathized with the cause of the Russian revolutionaries and admired their commitment to building a workers' state. The violence of the war lasted several months, with an estimated 7 to 12 million people killed on both sides. But the Red Army ultimately reigned supreme, and by January
That's a
1919,
lot.
virtually no white armed forces remained on Russian soil. War communism was ultimately the key to Bolshevik success. Without such harsh compulsion, mixed with spontaneous enthusiasm, the Civil War simply could not have been won. But in April 1919, Poland invaded the Ukraine, which sent Russia back into a
Uh-oh.
crisis as grave as the Civil War, and the Soviet leaders were forced to take a position on the Polish invasion. Was the Red Army to stand on the Polish frontier and offer terms of peace, or advance
Poland's in NATO now, I think, right? Hopefully they don't try and do any shenanigans like that again.
into Poland? The Red Army had done well in holding off Polish forces until this point, and therefore Lenin enthusiastically pushed for an advance into Polish industrial territories. However, this plan proved to be a complete failure. Lenin predicted that the Polish workers would greet the Soviets as their comrades and join forces to overthrow the Polish bourgeoisie.
Silly.
But this did not happen.
Yeah, it's silly. That's a silly thing to think. And we still have to deal with these types of thoughts to this day. That invading some country or whatever is going to automatically like the thinking the people are going to just get liberated or whatever, or like they're going to welcome you with open arms is a narrative that we still use to this day. And we just used it like to invade Iran. Like it's something we were trying to tell our people would happen as soon as we invaded, that they'd be greeted as like liberators. And it's just never the case. That was silly of them to think that.
In Poland, like elsewhere in Europe, the working class continued to demonstrate sympathy and even support for the Russian Revolution, but they were not yet ready to carry the banner of revolution in their own countries. For now, national rather than class allegiances prevailed among the European workers.
Probably still to this day. I mean, trying to get people to think in terms of like international communism or international socialism, we're so far away from that I'm like, I don't know if it's. I like reading like those sorts of like news articles and magazines from those types of publications and stuff about international socialism and stuff because we do need international solidarity to get, if we're going to defeat international capitalism. But Um, I think that first things first is getting class consciousness, like national class consciousness, at least here in America, but then also across the world, and then finally maybe some sort of national organizing. But it's so hard to organize that many people. I think it has to build its way up to that.
This embarrassing defeat also demonstrated weaknesses within the Red Army, whose rank and file largely consisted in peasants. It revealed that while these peasant soldiers may be willing to fight for revolution on their own soil, being asked to export revolution to foreign nations was a task that many were far less willing to fulfill. Once the difficulties of war were overcome on the home front, it was almost impossible to motivate soldiers to leave relatively peaceful conditions and fight foreign battles for their fellow workers. This realization was
Classic.
one of the greatest setbacks in the revolution thus far, and was a harsh reality check to some of the more utopian elements of the party regarding what could be realistically achieved through war communism
Hey,
alone.
there's always going to be there's always got to be some utopian visionaries in a movement like this. It's the only way to maintain the revolutionary fervor to some extent. So, um, I don't knock them. They like let people dream. Like I said, maybe someday we dream hard enough and attain enough power, it could happen. But yeah, I'm much more of a realist though when it comes to this sort of stuff. Personally, I'm not really a utopian visionary or anything like that.
When the Civil War came to an end and war communism fulfilled its purpose, the open question remained regarding a path forward. Were the economic policies of war communism an advancement towards socialism, or a detraction from it in order to persevere through the difficult circumstances of the Civil War? For some within the party, war communism was not only successful at meeting the needs of society, namely the Red Army, but centralization also demonstrated a successful alternative to a market economy. For this faction of the Bolshevik Party, strong evidence of socialist progress was being realized through war communism. Industry had been nationalized, grain surpluses were bringing economic stability, and the declining ruble could be read as society moving in a direction where money becomes obsolete. But others, including Lenin, understood that while centralization had effectively brought the labor force of key industries under the direct control of the Soviets, no such success was being achieved with the resentful peasant in the countryside.
Yeah.
Conditions in the years immediately following the revolution were so bad that Moscow lost 45% of its population, and Petrograd, an industrial center, lost 58% of its population. Masses of city dwellers fled to the countryside, where perhaps some food may still be found. But with war communism diverting the bulk of national resources to the Red Army, starvation in the countryside was also becoming real. A change of policy was urgently necessary. The introduction of the new economic policy.
This is where I think all of those stats that people love to say of communism has killed this many people or whatever. I think a lot of that comes from this, which like obviously, organizing your society is always going to lead to deaths, no matter what system you do. I would be curious if the same people applied that same logic to how many people capitalism has killed, how many people died from preventable diseases if they could have had health care, for example, or how many people, died in all of the various wars that capitalism has necessitated or whatever. Like I'm sure that you could do a crazy come up with some crazy number if you wanted to as well. But yeah, obviously if you're trying to organize your economy and you don't succeed very if you don't succeed, then there's gonna be some problems.
In March 1921, alleviated some of the difficulties of war communism by loosening centralized control over the economy. The essence of the new economic policy was in the notion that private property and markets must be reintroduced and allowed to thrive until the national currency is restabilized. Although the commanding heights of the economy would remain in the firm hands of the state, small producers were encouraged to seek a profit on the market after delivering a tax to state organs. If the kulak, who produced a surplus, was allowed to freely sell, then food supply and prices would restabilize, providing new ground for an advancement towards socialism. Opinions within the party were sharply divided. While it became clear that urgent policy changes were necessary, it was less clear how pursuing a market economy and enriching the kulak would help sustain the revolution. Some within the party opposed the new economic policy altogether and saw the reintroduction of a market economy as an abandonment of socialism. But the sharpest difference of opinion within the party remained on the question of the trade unions, which became an organ of the state as their independence was subordinated to the needs of war communism. But under the new economic policy, would the trade unions continue to function as an organ of the state, or would they defend specific interests and function independently of the regime within the factory? Trotsky, Bukharin, and Zinoviev took up the position that the trade unions should ultimately become incorporated into the state organs. But a faction formed within the party calling itself the Workers' Opposition, which took up the trade union perspective and advocated for trade union autonomy from the state. The Workers' Opposition was a quasi-syndicalist faction
This
with
seems a little bit like, what, does it matter that much? Like, I don't know. Maybe I don't understand this dynamic that much, but as long as the government is supporting the trade union, whether that union is like comes like directly under the government control or is independent, as long as there's not like as long as the government can force the hand of the opposition to the trade union, aka the what would in our society be like the capital owner or whatever. I guess in their society it is the government, so then maybe I understand the trade union should be a little bit independent of that. Yeah.
within the party that claimed to uphold the original ideals of the revolution. It gained a suspicious reputation within the party, but widespread sympathy among the workforce, as it argued against bureaucratization while promoting worker control over industry. The bitterness that ensued between the two sides of this issue deeply divided the party, and Congress was forced to pass two resolutions. The first declared that the syndicalist program of the Workers' Opposition was incompatible with the party platform. The second demanded the complete abolition of all factionalism. Opposition and debate would continue to be encouraged, but once a decision had been made, unconditional obedience was obligatory. Now that the Civil War had ended, the need for unity and compromise between party factions was no longer a pressing matter. Unity could now be achieved by removing dissenting parties from the organs of the state altogether. The final decision was a compromise between the two positions, which satisfied neither. Workers were allowed an autonomous organizing body for work-related issues such as wages, absenteeism, or workplace discipline, but the unions would ultimately be subjected, through either persuasion or compulsion, to the demands of the state. Although the new economic policy sought to retract the harms of war,
that's where I'm on the opposite side now. Now that I think about it a little bit more, I think the workers should be able to represent themselves. Because I just see the government as potentially replacing the capital owners and ending up being just as like brutal or barbaric towards their people or whatever. I think having more independent power at the workplace is probably the best bet there. I guess it also depends on how democratic the actual governing body is as well, of whether I would say that it's okay for them to be controlled or operated in some semblance by the government. But yeah.
Or communism, the benefits to the peasant came too late. The calamities of war and natural disaster contributed to a poor harvest in 1921, and the worst famine in 30 years plagued Russia, starving an estimated 5 million people. The Bolsheviks did not yet have a concrete plan for how to stabilize food supply while also generating a surplus for the state. War communism leaned too far towards generating surplus at the cost of a dwindling food supply. The new economic policy, with the reintroduction of the market economy, restabilized the food supply, but surplus was no longer channeled towards the state, but the private coffers of the kulak. The debate between elements of a market economy and elements of a command economy would characterize a continual struggle within the party for years to come.
So intense. The new Soviet order.
In the summer of 1918, the Bolsheviks ratified the first constitution of the new Russian Federative Socialist Republic. The first constitutional act was called the Declaration of the Rights of the Toiling and Exploited People, and was modeled from the French Revolution's Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen. It declared that the Russian Soviet...
I love the French Revolution, by the way. It's one of my favorite time periods.
Republic is founded on the basis of a free union between free nations as a federation of Soviet national republics. It also enunciated such general principles as the separation of church and state, workers' freedom of speech, assembly and opinion, military conscription, abolition of racial or ethnic discrimination,
Whoa.
full autonomy
Based.
for women, as well as the
Based.
obligation and right to employment.
Hey, if that was in our constitution, maybe we'd be in a much better place. Although our current government seems to be wiping its ass with the constitution, so maybe not. I think global capital would probably uh, ignore those parts of the constitution as it currently is ignoring it. But still, it's still pretty base to have all that shit in there.
He who does not work, neither shall he eat. The Constitution sought not only to situate Russia in the tradition of the
Wait a
French.
second. Okay, that's a little general right there. I think that he who does not work, neither shall he eat. I think that I assume that they mean you're not going to be making money off of the surplus labor value of other people or whatever is what they're trying to say. But obviously, there's always going to be a certain segment of the populace who is unable to work through either disability or, uh, you know, incapability or whatever, right? So, like, obviously, those people still need to eat.
The Constitution sought not only to situate Russia in the tradition of the French Revolution, but to highlight the international intentions of the revolution as well. Internationalism was the strongest weapon the Bolsheviks had against the imperialist powers, which without it, the revolution could hardly hope to survive. In wake of the Civil War, Lenin clearly understood the immediate necessity of international worker solidarity, which he sought to cultivate through the establishment of the Third Communist International, the Comintern, on March 2, 1919. The Comintern united delegates from communist movements across the world under an international banner, and quickly became the most important organization for the advancement of world revolution. Immediately after its establishment, the first priority of the Comintern was to address the rift.
This is one of those things where I'm like, it's like, I love how like ambitious and global they're thinking, but I do sometimes feel like that ambition can sometimes lead to a lot of the problems that we will see eventually at some point with the USSR and stuff. But I do love it, like an international like revolutionary force where you're like or like where you're trying to help people rise up and throw off the yoke of their oppression or whatever. Like obviously there's not really any profitability to that or whatever to some extent or like to any extent really. So there's never going to be some capitalist system set up to like help people overthrow oppression or whatever. It's actually the opposite. Capitalism's out there, trying to get more and more people to be oppressed so they can extract more surplus labor value. But um, man, I do love that ambition. I love it. I wish I had that kind of ambition.
Between the capitalist and socialist worlds by lending support to the worker uprisings taking place across Europe. Support for the European proletariat in achieving revolution in their own countries was always linked to Russia's need to defend its revolution from European powers. International worker solidarity was the strongest weapon the Bolsheviks had against Western imperialism. Although the Comintern placed much emphasis on European revolution, perhaps its most significant impact was felt in the colonial world. For colonized nations across Latin America, Asia, and Africa, Russia demonstrated a path to national self-determination and was the most important ally in the struggle for national liberation. Lenin called for a close alliance of all national and colonial liberation movements with Soviet Russia.
And I think this is where I think the USSR and stuff heavily funded a lot of, the rebellions of various colonized peoples to overthrow their colonizers or whatever, which is like one of the most, one of the most base things in history.
For the most part, the colonial world was under too firm imperialist pressure to extend delegation to the Comintern or advance any meaningful relationship to the Soviets. But for colonized nations growing willing and ready to wage revolutionary struggle of their own, allying with Russia through the Comintern was an indispensable tool for achieving liberation. Internal party organization saw great restructuring around principles of democratic centralism as well. peasants and workers of different localities participated in Soviet councils, which voted for members of the Central Committee, who themselves held elections for the 9 members of the Politburo and General Secretary. The Politburo was now the supreme body of political decision-making. The Central Committee was the administrative body, while the Soviet councils gave workers and peasants a direct link to the democratic processes of the state.
Pretty standard
As
stuff.
the country advanced towards economic recovery and the party
That's just pretty standard democratic structure, to be honest.
Structured itself, it sought to unify into a single unit by persuading the 3 republics in the Caucasus, Armenia, Georgia, and Azerbaijan, to unite into a Trans-Caucasian Socialist Federal Republic. By December 1923, the Federal Russian as well as Trans-Caucasian republics joined together to establish the United Soviet Socialist Republics, the USSR.
There it is.
Soviet relations with the outside world were beginning to improve in all directions. Soviet delegates signed trade agreements and treaties with various countries, including France, Germany, Denmark, Estonia, Afghanistan, Persia, and Turkey. The Anglo-Soviet trade agreement with Britain was particularly hailed as a landmark achievement, as it gave the Soviets a foothold in the world system of trade. However, in exchange for this foothold, the Soviets ensured that they would not incite revolutionary propaganda among the British workers. Here the Soviets were faced with the difficult...
You can't infect our people with your woke mind virus. Come on, guys. That's the one condition we're putting on you.
decision of adhering to their principles of international revolution and be treated as a pariah state on the world stage, or remain silent on questions of proletarian internationalism and more deeply entrench itself into the capitalist world system.
Those are some scary words, okay? We gotta stop this.
The suffering endured throughout the early years of the revolution called for stability more than anything, which required the Soviets to favor policies which may not have been ideal but were expedient under the difficult circumstances. Whether consciously or not, pronouncements of world revolution began to slip into the background of Soviet diplomacy, as to not to disturb the normal conduct of diplomatic affairs. At the dawn of the revolution, Trotsky claimed that international revolution would occur within a matter of weeks. But now he regretfully claimed...
Stop it. Never predict. Never make predictions on timelines. It's always a bad idea. You're going to be proven wrong every single time.
It was perhaps a question of years. The utopian visions of an international socialist future were slowly evaporating. The process of economic recovery, inaugurated by the new economic policy, was overshadowed in 1922 by the onset of Lenin's prolonged illness. In May, he suffered a stroke while recovering from surgery, which removed a bullet from his neck since the failed assassination attempt in 1918. The stroke incapacitated him for many weeks, and after briefly returning to the Kremlin, he suffered a second, more severe stroke, which paralyzed his right side and prevented him from returning to work. On April 4, 1922, even before Lenin's first stroke, it was announced that Stalin had been appointed General Secretary.
Stalin.
Nobody found the announcement particularly significant.
That's the boogeyman of the entire West.
Stalin was
Look
known
at
as
that
a hard
mustache.
worker.
Oh, so this is where I'm talking about the handsome. This they put in like a looks maxer dude up here, man. He is a hottie.
Working, efficient, and loyal party official who adhered closely to the principles of Marxism and held a fierce commitment to building socialism. He was also seen as a moderate voice, which could consolidate the left and right tendencies within the party. But when Lenin returned to work after his first stroke, he was alarmed at how Stalin had structured the power and authority of his office. Before suffering his third stroke in March 1923, Lenin wrote his infamous testament, where he warned against keeping Stalin as General Secretary. Embarrassed by its contents, Stalin offered his resignation, but the party refused and retained him as General Secretary. Furthermore, prominent leaders such as Zinoviev and Kamenev had no interest in preventing Stalin's rise, but instead drew together with Stalin in a determined effort to block any advancement in Trotsky's role. Trotsky was a newcomer to the Bolshevik Party with a record of past dissent, and was an isolated figure without Lenin. He was regarded with jealous dislike by his colleagues, whom he treated with a certain arrogance, and his past advocacy for
Uh-oh.
militarization of
Don't ever put me in a position of power, people. Like, I swear, I'm way too arrogant. I will piss off everybody, and I will 100% get assassinated. No doubt. That's why I will never be a part of the revolution. I will just support the revolution from the wings. Like, I can't do it, man. I got this mouth that just it don't stop. You know what I'm saying?
the workforce made him suspect in trade union circles as well. Once Stalin, Zinoviev, and Kamenev successfully blocked his advancement in the Politburo, the time soon arrived to crush him altogether. Towards the end of 1923, Trotsky published a number of articles in the state newspaper Pravda, indirectly criticizing Stalin, Zinoviev, and Kamenev as the incorrect and unhealthy regime in the party. Stalin responded with a full-scale attack in Pravda, which called for the end of party dissent and the purging of dissident members.
Uh-oh. Never want to hear that.
Trotsky was personally identified as a problematic element, and the new term Trotskyist became synonymous with opposition. Outnumbered, Trotsky gave up the uneven battle and headed for the Caucasus, shortly before Lenin passed away on January 21st, 1924. Lenin had always remained committed to the vision of a homogeneous revolutionary leadership, consisting of an elite group of reliable and dedicated workers. During the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917, party membership was no more than 25,000. But in early 1921, when party membership had reached a total of roughly 700,000, Lenin found it necessary to purge much of the bloated bureaucracy, and by the beginning of 1924, membership was reduced by 50% to roughly 350,000. But after his rise to power, Stalin sought to reverse this course when later that year he introduced the Lenin enrollment, recruiting 240,000 new members to the party. The shift away from the vanguard party of Lenin to the mass party of Stalin was also ushered in alongside a new type of secular worship and devotion to the deceased party leader. Petrograd was renamed Leningrad, and Stalin published On the Foundations of Leninism, which canonized Lenin's thought by laying out its theoretical premises and its relationship to Marxism.
Yeah, that's something that's something that you kind of got to do, I think, no matter what, as a leader is not you can't really you can't I mean you can go one of two routes. You can either completely and totally vilify the previous part of the revolution, but usually that doesn't go very good. And the better route is, yeah, you kind of deify them, but then kind of reappropriate their stuff into what you're trying to accomplish as a leader. So I'm assuming that's kind of what Stalin's doing here.
Stalin's lionization of Lenin as an attempt to consolidate power by tying the image and spirit of Lenin to himself. But others, even bourgeois historians, point out that Stalin was indeed ideologically committed to Marxism and Leninism. He did not see them as hollow theories simply used to consolidate power, but truly believed in the doctrines which they espoused. In this way, Stalin was somewhat unique in his relationship to Lenin. He viewed himself not as an innovator, but the custodian of party orthodoxy, and often took pains to represent himself as a junior partner or devoted disciple of Lenin, often referring to him as his teacher. Trotsky, who was in a precarious position within the party, did not view Lenin the same way and had frequent disagreements with him. But after being denounced as an opposition leader, Trotsky attempted to conform to the new Leninist ideology of the party by renouncing his earlier positions, stating that one cannot be right against the party, just or unjust. This is my party, and I bear the consequences of its decision to the end. This reversal, however, did not deter open attacks proceeding from Stalin, Zinoviev, or in particular Kamenev, who launched into a lengthy speech based on his written work, Leninism or Trotskyism, which highlighted the incompatibility between these two modes of thought, and by extension, the incompatibility between Trotsky and the party. Back in 1905, Trotsky wrote that the initial stages of revolution would be anti-feudal and bourgeois in character, and that if a proletarian revolution ever came to Russia, it would remain incomplete until it was spread to the rest of the world. His theory was generally consistent with Lenin's April theses, which included the assertion that revolution in Russia was dependent on the international communist movement.
Yeah, these are so cool. They got because I don't know, they well also they chatify everybody, but they I love when they have like the workers in their like work uniforms, like I assume like throwing rocks or whatever, like this is stuff that I would love to see some more things like this in America, some more agitprop.
Nobody seemed to pay much attention to Trotsky's theory of permanent
Oh,
revolution until
chatty.
Bukharin resurrected it by pointing out its
Hey there, Mom. How's it going?
divergencies from Lenin. These criticisms against Trotsky generally reflected the shifting ideology of the party. As the Soviet Union became more deeply entrenched in the world system, it became increasingly reluctant to preach socialist revolution to workers of foreign countries. Such agitation would undermine the bourgeois governments through which Soviet stability came to rely. Stalin was therefore led to part ways with the idea of internationalism and advance the doctrine of socialism in one country. He inaugurated this theory by attempting to lean on Lenin by locating scattered passages in his writings that appeared to suggest the viability of socialism in one country. But anyone who was even remotely familiar with Lenin's thought
Yeah.
knew it was a complete deviation from Lenin and a reversal of the earlier policy which directly pinned the success of Russian socialism on international revolution. But practical necessity called for theoretical revision. Although Stalin initiated the doctrine of socialism in one country, he never entirely abandoned the idea of international.
See, I don't even necessarily disagree with that assessment by Stalin. And like, not that I don't like appreciate the aspects of international socialism that Lenin and Trotsky were trying to espouse. But I think you well, especially nowadays, I guess you can't really build enough power to confront international capitalism until you, in my opinion, until you organize at the state level. So like so I don't even necessarily disagree with this as with this from Stalin, but
Revolution, admitting that for a complete victory of socialism, for a complete guarantee against restoration of the old order of things, the combined efforts of the proletariat of several countries is indispensable. But Stalin and much of the party knew that realistically, help from abroad remained a futile hope. If the survival of the revolution relied on international revolution, then a situation without an international revolution meant that Russia's survival could only depend on Russia itself. The doctrine of socialism in one country was heading towards a self-sustainable Russian economy, whose independence would be maintained through modernized industry. By 1922, the new economic policy had proven successful in overcoming the limitations of war communism.
sorry, I missed that title card. Uh, Chapter 6, The Planned Economy. Cover your ears, capitalists. This one's going to scare you a lot.
By 1922, the new economic policy had proven successful in overcoming the limitations of war communism. Grain supplies had eventually been restored, and prices between town and country were restabilized. However, with the return of the market economy, the kulak was regaining a strong foothold on the economic situation in the countryside. Many kulaks were accused of price gouging by manipulating the supply of grain, retaining large quantities in the fall, and selling deer in the spring when
They're really not. They really don't like the kulaks. Look at that face, man. It's like a combination of well, it kind of looks like a naked mole rat. Like they took a naked mole rat and threw some hair and a mustache on him, and maybe fed him a little too much.
prices had reached their highest point. Agricultural prices soared until July 1922, when the Soviet government responded by implementing a series of price controls which temporarily restored price stability. But by 1923, these policies had reversed the course of price inflation so much such that industrial prices now greatly surpassed agricultural prices. And by October 1923, the scissor blades had opened the widest yet. Industrial prices were 3 times higher than agricultural prices. As worker strikes and unrest broke out across the country, a scissors committee was established to address the economic crisis.
Scissors
Trotsky, the
crisis.
leader of the committee, showed frustration with the continuous balancing act being forced on the state between agriculture and industry. His report to the 12th Party Congress described this process on a graph, which showed how the crisis deepened as the scissor blades of agriculture and industry continued to diverge. He argued that the long-term solution to this problem would be through the rationalization of industry, but for now, the short-term solution would be to fix retail prices in key sectors. Unlike the crisis of war communism, which was a crisis of a command economy, the crisis of the new economic policy was a crisis of a market economy, where prices were set by private sellers. The years 1922 and 1923 were years of successful grain harvest, but price manipulations led to a scissors crisis. To stabilize prices, the Soviets purchased large quantities of grain by printing rubles, which further dropped the value of the already debased currency and led to a devaluation of real wages by about 40%. It was a
Yeah.
temporary fix to the long-term contradiction between town and country that would eventually need to be resolved through a pivot towards a fully planned economy.
Hmm.
As economic planning developed, a sharp point of division within the State General Planning Committee emerged from the conflict between what became called the geneticists, such as Bukharin, and the teleologists, including Trotsky and Zinoviev. The
Oh,
geneticists
I don't like that. I don't like that name. I don't think I ever want to be called a geneticist. I don't know what it means yet. I'm gonna learn here in a second, but that doesn't sound good.
argued that planning must be based on the objective tendencies of the economic situation and should be limited to those tendencies.
Yeah, see, that's not that bad. But I assume they mean genetic in like the more general abstract term of like coming from something else or whatever. But it does sound a little bit rough.
The teleologists, however, maintain that the decisive factor was the goal in view, and to transform the economic situation altogether. The question came down to the cost that would be paid by the peasant. At the party conference in April 1925, Bukharin delivered his most outspoken support of the peasant, and even pleaded for concessions to the middle and top layers of the peasantry. On the question between industry and agriculture, Bukharin was the strongest proponent of agriculture, and believed that industry would need to be built through a snail's pace as to not to disrupt the peasant economy. Bukharin told the kulaks
Mm.
to enrich yourselves, reasoning that the ongoing sustainment of a rural bourgeoisie was a small price to pay for stable economic growth.
Yeah, when I look at this, I just like think about the comparison between how they function, and obviously it was a different time with different technological capabilities, different world conditions, all that sort of stuff. But I always think about how China like industrialized so quickly through state capitalism or whatever that I like, and there was little to no like strife during that process or whatever, or like at least not that I'm aware of, like not more than like any other country that industrializes as far as I know. um, and I'm like, yeah, that I think China had it right. I think state capitalism is the way to go to get to a socialist state personally.
Coercive measures against the peasant resulted in shortages.
But we still got to see, like, China, like, I do believe, I do generally believe that the CCP, like, still holds to some extent the ideals of communism as the end stage that they're aiming for. But that all depends on, the, like, the future leadership, like where it goes, all that sort of stuff too, if they actually ever do transition to like a fully socialist state.
And price gouging. Therefore, he argued that gradual and incremental growth of industry could only be achieved through the stability brought by market reforms in the countryside. But Bukharin was strongly opposed within the party. Throughout 1926 and 1927, there was a sharp turn against the new economic policy by the advocates of industrialization. Zinoviev criticized concessions to the peasantry and argued that the peasant is becoming the only real master of the Soviet land. He then launched into an attack on Bukharin's slogan for the kulak to enrich yourselves by recalling Lenin's declaration.
Man, so I've been watching Stargate, and every time they say kulak, I think they're saying like some like space term, like Goa'uld or whatever. Like I'm like, man, what these? It sounds like an alien.
But the new economic policy was only intended as a temporary retreat, not a long-term policy. Kamenev and Trotsky agreed and joined with Zinoviev to form a united opposition to Stalin and Bukharin's concessions to the peasantry. In the past, Kamenev and Zinoviev had vehemently criticized Trotsky's positions with blistering attacks, but now that they had become so repelled by the situation, they saw it politically expedient to unite with their former rival. Tensions within the Politburo soon reached their peak when Trotsky launched into an attack on Stalin and branded him a gravedigger of the revolution. At a party conference in October, Stalin responded by recalling Trotsky's early associations with Mensheviks as well as his hostile exchanges with Lenin. Trotsky was then accused not only of factionalism within the party, but also for social democratic deviation from the party itself. In the spring of 1927, after prolonged agitation by the united opposition, Trotsky and Zinoviev were summoned before a disciplinary committee and threatened with expulsion from the party altogether. Stalin and Trotsky angrily fired back and forth with one another, until Stalin finally questioned Trotsky's loyalty to the Soviet state, thereby branding him not merely a heretic, but a traitor. Under these circumstances, Trotsky and Zinoviev were compelled to sign an oath of loyalty to the USSR and declare that they would not split the party or form a new one.
Loyalty
At
pledge.
the Central Committee of the Comintern in September 1928, Trotsky indicted Stalin's policies in a belligerent 2-hour rant. He was then voted out of the Comintern Central Committee with only 2 dissenting votes. Similar events followed in the Party Central Committee, where Stalin was now ready to expel Trotsky, Zinoviev, and Kamenev. Zinoviev and Kamenev were banished to Kaluga, which is only several hundred miles outside of Moscow.
That's a funny name.
Trotsky, however, had been banished to Alma-Ata, a remote location in Central Asia without direct access to transportation, and there he remained until his final deportation from the USSR the following year.
They're going full America on him, deporting him. There's some dangerous ideas.
Stalin was originally supportive of Bukharin's position of prolonging the new economic policy. But as price gouging, shortages, and economic crises began, the need for policy changes became clear. Concessions to the peasantry were intended to resolve the economic crisis and bring stability, but now these concessions were creating a new crisis. Bukharin's perspective fell out of favor with the party, and Stalin would soon pivot towards the vision of the teleologists and compromise with Zinoviev and Kamenev by readmitting them back into the party. In 1921, dissent within the party was seen as factionalism, but was not yet associated with disloyalty to the state. One could disagree with the tactics of Bolshevism, but still be committed to a future Soviet socialist society. But by 1927, the distinction between party dissent and state sedition was gradually eroded. Stalin often tried to moderate or balance the interests of the geneticists and teleologists, and was even willing to change his own.
It's not going good. It's not going good when the dissent really starts getting cracked down on. I think that we in modern America can kind of relate to some extent where we're slowly losing our ability or allowed allowances to dissent against our government, slowly but surely. We still superficially can or whatever, but when it counts, when you actually go against the stated interest of the country or the government, say for instance protesting Israel or whatever, then the full-throated boot of the government is going to come and stamp you down.
Perspective based on the
so in both situations it's things aren't going so good, and so the regime becomes a lot more brutal.
Economic situation. But more often than not, economic and political emergency strengthen the need for a firm, undivided, absolute authority. Loyalty and unity were needed within the party.
Supreme leader.
And with the concentration of power in a very small circle led by Stalin, much of this loyalty to the state and party was in certain ways extended to Stalin himself.
The 5-year plan, industrialization. I wonder if this is where. Well, no, they were doing 5. Were they doing 5-year plans before the Russian Revolution in China? I can't remember. I don't know
As
when
the
they started doing that.
limitations of the market economy became clear, a transition began towards a planned economy, where decision making and investment were to be made not through the market, but through the far reaching industrial projects planned by the state. The victory of industrialization was sealed with the completion of the first 5-year plan in May 1929.
Ah,
It was
if
an
only.
impressively broad and detailed assessment and plan around which the whole economy came to revolve. The abandonment and replacement of a market economy with a planned economy was a
If
complete
only, if only, if only someday America. Someday America, please, please. You don't even have to go to 5 years. Like I know, like currently we think in quarters in America, aka like 3 months. Like if you could just get bump it up to like 2 years. Like try to plan some goal for 2 years out. I have to do this shit at my job. I have to plan like my goal for the year or whatever. Like where do I see myself in 5 years, 10 years, whatever. Like and our government can't fucking just like tell us what they want to achieve in like like 1 year, 5 years, 10 years. Like come on, man. I just we need something like this. We need 5 year plans and shit.
completely untried concept and a plunge into the unknown. The planning program focused heavily on the goal of economic self-sufficiency, which meant converting the USSR from a country that imports machines and equipment into a country that produces machines and equipment. Some of the 5-year plan estimates proved overly optimistic, especially as targets were raised
Hey,
progressively higher, but it gave powerful impetus
there's
to
nothing
ambitious
wrong with
projects in
that.
heavy industry
I mean,
and
you want to set realistic goals, obviously. If you're always setting like unrealistic goals, it's not like that's not good. Like I think that China generally sets goals that they achieve or whatever. And I think it looks really good on them when they do it. It's a good source of like propaganda and like showing to your people that you're achieving stuff. But there's nothing wrong with having a little bit of ambition in your 5 year plans, I think.
generated a great wave of optimism. The impetus for the decision to move toward a planned economy resulted from the failures of the market economy to modernize Russian industry. The main problem was that Russia, as a backward semi-feudal country, was a high-cost producer of industrial goods and could not compete on the global market with Western powers such as the US or Great Britain. Russian agriculture, however, was a low-cost producer, and with the abundant supply of land and peasant labor, maximum return on capital investment would be realized through investing in agriculture rather than industry. Under the dictates and rationale of a market economy, industrialization and modernization were therefore seen as irrational. Why divert investment to industry, a high-cost producer with little to no return on investment, when a greater return can be realized with investment in expanding agriculture, a low-cost producer? Under the prevailing economic conditions, modernizing industry was therefore seen as wasteful. Getting through this contradiction was a serious limitation embedded in the new economic policy, which prevented Russia from transitioning from an agricultural to industrial economy. Planning sought to overcome this contradiction by modernizing Russian industry at a rapid pace to close the gap between Russia and the West. Russian industry may be inefficient and generate little surplus, but after enough growth and investment, it had the potential to match the forces of production of the West.
Yeah.
Stalin painted
Well,
this
they
mission.
need to. They need to. Like they need to get their productive capabilities at the same level as capital, and honestly surpass capitalism. Um, if they're like, I don't know. I think that like sort of. I think you need to do that. Like this slow snail's pace thing is not going to work, especially when the forces of capital are constantly at your door, like trying to, tear down how you're trying to organize your society. So, like, I think that you have to quickly get up to the productive capabilities of the, global capitalist like countries or whatever, um, and then surpass them. And then at that point, you're kind of like off to the races. Like you're home free basically. That's kind of where I feel China is right now. Is they're basically surpassed us in productive capabilities, and so like what are we gonna do? Like what are we gonna do? There's nothing you can do. If they surpass your productive capabilities, then they can defeat you in war. You can't do anything about it. It's like I don't know. I think that that's definitely necessary and definitely the right strat that they took at this particular moment in the Russian Revolution.
as a matter of life and death for the Soviet Union. We are 50 or 100 years behind the advanced countries. We must make a good distance in 10 years. Either we do it, or they will crush us.
Oh, that's what I said basically.
The Soviet Union, though perhaps a little tardy, was quickly building towards the industrial vision of the 5-year plan. In the summer of 1926, an American engineer who played a leading role in building the Hoover Dam agreed to supervise the construction of a Soviet dam and hydroelectric station. The project also involved the recruitment of a small army of additional American engineers and American technology. By 1934, the dam was completed, power was supplied to the Donbass mines, and new steel and iron industries were set up to absorb its output.
Surprised they even let them do
1/7
that.
of all
The
industrial
Americans.
investment went to the production of iron and steel. The dams energized the mines, the output was sent to the steel and iron mills, then channeled to the producers in the factories. It was the emergence of a vast industrial complex of organizing the production of the means of production. In 1927, the
It's a little
first and
circular,
newly
but sure.
established Soviet automobile factory generated much publicity. Though it only played a small role in the 5-year plan, generating 10,000 automobiles a year, in 1929 an agreement was signed with the Ford Motor Company for the construction of a factory with the capacity to produce 200,000 automobiles in 10 years. Parallel
Ford did that?
developments were seen in the
I didn't know that Ford did any work in like the USSR. That seems kind of crazy to me. I thought he was like crazy capitalist. Like he like made like company towns and shit. That's very surprising to me.
growing production of tractors as well, which the 5-year plan set at 50,000 annually. From 1928 onward, the production of heavy machinery, including trains, factories, tractors, and automobiles, would set the pace of transformation in the peasant economy. Industrial wages remained a central issue governing the relationship between worker, employer, and the state. Under the new economic policy, wage struggles were generally left to trade unions and the employer. But now, the Politburo held a total annual wage fund, which was to be distributed across all industries. The wage fund helped stabilize prices and gave financial priority to industries that were encouraged to expand. Wages, as well as the production of consumer goods, were kept at a minimum as all surplus was diverted not to households or individuals, but industry. During this period, unions no longer negotiated with employers for wages, but were now enrolled to enforce labor discipline by preventing strikes and walkouts, as well as
Okay.
sanctioning absenteeism and drunkenness on the job. Workers and union leaders, many of whom were former Mensheviks, despised the naked exploitation of the workforce,
Yeah.
as well as their assumed role under the new state mandate. Conditions of scarcity had led to a scissors crisis in the past, and some expressed concern that the party was pursuing a dangerous path by keeping the production of consumer goods at minimally necessary levels.
Oh, yeah, that's not good. So this is where like in the future, when there is like socialism or whatever, you still need the veneer of, I think, capitalism. You still need like the treats, I think. Treats are a very important aspect of keeping a populace stable or whatever, keeping a populace from like picking up arms and like going out on a revolution or in some cases counter-revolution against, the society that you're trying to organize. And so you got to keep them treats flowing, man. Whatever system of government you come up with, I don't care what it is, you got to keep the treats flowing, especially here in America. If you don't keep the treats flowing, like the hogs are going to go wild.
Although real wages of the workers rose from 1923 to 1927, the onset of the planned economy began with a heavy burden placed on the worker. Workers were placed under greater discipline, and the scarcity of consumer goods offered little in return for the heavy labor they were carrying out in the mines, factories, and fields. A series of incentives were
That was
introduced
bad.
to encourage worker participation in building the future industrial society. The Hero of Labor title and the
Yeah, this is wrong. They just did this wrong. The workers have to be central to your organization of society. If they feel like they're being essentially like enslaved, whether it's at the behest of capital or at the behest of a government like who is like going to, I don't know, like throw you in jail if you don't do your work, you're really not setting up yourself for success. And little things like this don't do much. Like these aren't the types of treats they want. Like you need to keep them happy through, number one, let them fucking unionize and strike, like, and be on their side, like, as much as you possibly can if you're the government in this situation. But also, yeah, provide them with as many treats as possible so that they can say, hey, I don't got, I mean, I might be having to work really hard, but at least I got my, you know, my radio or whatever. They would be happy about in this time, or like.
Order of the Red Banner of Labor were created to recognize key contributions. And to celebrate the 10th anniversary of the revolution, Lenin's Communist Saturdays from 1919, volunteer days of
That's what I
unpaid
should call
work,
this
were now
this
reintroduced in
segment.
some regions to add to the workforce of the rapidly changing society.
Like I should call this stream that I do sometimes Communist Saturdays.
The period was not so much characterized by resistance, but general apathy among the workforce. The rapid pace of industrialization would eventually allow the USSR to catch up to the West and make it capable of confronting the capitalist world both economically and militarily. But the fruits of these changes had yet to have any material impact on the worker's life. Employing means of production to produce means of production did not yield any immediate gains in terms of consumer commodities. Years would need to pass before the benefits of this policy would yield any direct results for the worker. The adoption of the first five-year plan was a landmark in Soviet history. The prestige of the plan and the USSR was enhanced by the economic crash of 1929 and the Great Depression. The capitalist order had come under severe instability as the USSR felt its general immunity from the worst symptoms of the crisis. As unemployment levels reached 30 to 40% in Western countries, particularly the US, the Soviet employment rate remained at virtually 100%. The demand for an element of planning in the economies of the capitalist countries grew everywhere, which substantially influenced Western attitudes towards the USSR.
So this was all way before the Red Scare stuff. Okay, gotcha. So this is the Great Depression, which is the one time in history that communists and socialists had any sort of power in America. You see all these signs, like, I don't know if this is in America or whatever, but uh, like, build a labor party on this sign. Like, I don't know. This was the one time when labor like started to accumulate a decent amount of power in America. And it still wasn't even that much. And then we've got FDR, and then we got Social Security and Medicare. So for everybody out there who hates the socialists and hates the communists and think that capitalism is a perfect system and has never done anything wrong, and you hate me because I'm even remotely mentioning the word socialism or communism in like a non-negative light or whatever. Remember what you got. Remember what you got from socialism. Remember what you got from communism. Whether they were in power or not, they pressured America to give us two of the best policies by even America's like populist standard that have ever existed, like Social Security and Medicare. If you want that again, you're going to need, to borrow a phrase from like the Democrats or whatever, you're going to need a strong socialist party. You're going to need a strong communist party if you want to get those types of policies ever again. The Democrats don't say that. They say we need a strong Republican Party. I'm like, no, you do not. You need a strong Socialist Party to get, good things for the workers. Collectivization of
As the planning committee struck a balance between the geneticists and the teleologists, the ultimate goal of planning became to develop industry enough to make the USSR self-sufficient. But by the end of 1927, the situation became desperate. Cheese, butter, or milk were rarely to be had. Bread queues became common in the cities, and prices had soared nearly 200% as scarcity became chronic. Deficiencies were made up through mixing barley and maize with wheat flour, using coarse grinding methods, and distributing ration cards among workers. A series of emergency decrees, what were called extraordinary measures, were introduced to mitigate the crisis. Officials were sent to the countryside to enforce the widespread collection of grain. Every layer of the peasantry was forced to surrender more and make do with less. Not only were these harsh measures hated by the peasant and kulak in the countryside, but they shook the ranks of the party as well. Bukharin spoke of the waves of dissatisfaction among the peasantry, who perceived a return of war communism. The root problem of the agricultural crisis was traced to the backward organization of the peasant economy. Small peasant holdings that practiced ancient three-field rotation were plainly incompatible with an efficient agriculture. These pre-modern agricultural methods were suitable to the peasants, who produced enough for themselves and little more, but the small surpluses they generated were simply not sufficient for an entire country transitioning through heavy industrialization.
Well, and also they don't have any they don't like what do they want to get with their surplus, right? Like you need to offer them something for their surplus value if you want them to like continue to modernize and like become more efficient and stuff. Like that's something that capitalists do really well is that there is an incentive to to generate surplus because when you generate surplus, then you can go buy that flat screen TV or whatever. Or you can go buy whatever treat you want, all that sort of stuff. So, um, like you do need to incentivize people to like generate surplus, whether that's through like capitalism, like state capitalism, or the government offering you the things for that surplus value is whatever.
The smallest unit of the peasant economy was not the individual, but the household, who organized members to work on a plot of land they collectively occupied.
And that's if you need surplus, by the way, as well. If you don't, like in a perfectly planned economy, you don't necessarily even need to create surplus or whatever. But yeah.
These households formed together into peasant communities and handled local matters like building roads or sharing resources. Within these village communities, a kulak oversaw local affairs while seeking a profit. The kulaks owned large plots of land and urged peasants to produce a large surplus. A farming community without a kulak were collective farms, comprised of self-organized peasants working land held in common. Some within the party viewed the collective farm as a stepping stone towards socialism, and believe that agriculture and industry may be inspired from the cooperative model of the collective farm. But others recognize that while socialized production may prevail on these collective farms, they produced only a slight surplus, and therefore needed to develop a collective model of industrial agriculture by achieving mass production with modern machinery. Another form of agricultural organization was the Soviet farm that operated under the mandate of the state. The state owned and controlled the land, as well as the equipment and machinery provided to the peasants to work the land. Soviet farms, conceived of as massive grain factories, were introduced to modernize collective farming practices under war communism, but had withered away under the new economic policy and currently constituted only 2% of total output in the countryside. Soviet farms were not only absent a kulak, but because they employed modern farming equipment, were also more efficient producers than the collective farms. Soviet farms also coincided well with the planners' vision to modernize the peasant economy, and therefore became an attractive solution to the dilemma of agriculture. The party underlined the Soviet farm as the model farm, not only setting an example of modern methods of cultivation, but also incentivizing peasants with tractors and other modern farming equipment. Shortly after the spring of 1929, a new procedure for grain collections was introduced, with high quotas fixed for different regions and collections agencies. The peasant, not only the kulak, became frantic to conceal or sell on the market any surplus they had. Concealment or even failure to meet quotas was deemed a criminal offense. Those who were caught were fined, sentenced to imprisonment, or banished from the local village.
I don't disagree. I don't disagree with that. If you're trying to plan an economy and and people aren't, giving you the information that you need in order to do so, there has to be some form of punishment for that. So, yeah.
Widely and arbitrarily applied, while scenes of violence and brutality occurred in open hostilities between the peasants and the authorities. It was under these conditions that the demand for the collective organization of agriculture was intensely pressed. The kulak was eventually denounced as an undefeated enemy who could not be admitted to the collective farm, but their means of production as well as their land were to be transferred to them. Recalcitrant kulaks would be expelled, but those willing to stay might be employed in some capacity within the collective farm. The resolution of January 5, 1930 was the key decision in the process of collectivization. It proclaimed the replacement of the kulaks by the collective farm and the liquidation of the kulak as a class. During the winter that year, 25,000 industrial workers, volunteers, activists,
Bye-bye,
and Red
kulaks.
Army soldiers were assigned permanent work in rural areas to aid in the peasants' transition onto the collective farms. Tens of thousands of kulaks were evicted from their holdings, made to fend for themselves, and sent adrift into exile. Their implements and machines were handed over to the state, but what they resented most was the surrender of their livestock, which many preferred to slaughter rather than hand over.
Come on, dude.
Collectivization was moved.
These people have no loyalty to like anything. They sound like they suck. The kulaks, no offense. I don't know. I mean, I guess not no offense, but yeah, they sound like they're just kind of like essentially like landlords of like farms basically. And the fact that they would like rather slaughter their stuff than like give it over to the people who are coming in to start running your farms in co-op structure or whatever is just like so petty.
Moving at a quicker pace than what industry could keep up with, causing a shortage of tractors and other industrial equipment in the countryside. In March 1930, Stalin published an article titled Dizzy from Success, which acknowledged the achievements of collectivization,
Sounds like Trump.
but called for a reduction of its pace. Many restrictions were then loosened, and peasants were free to leave the collective farms. This fortunate step and good weather led to a wonderful harvest season with a record grain count. But the full cost of this grand transformation was not long delayed. Production had been disorganized, and the most efficient producers, the kulaks, were thrown out. As the collective farms produced greater yields than individual peasants, the state continued to raise quotas, and because of the harsh requisitioning, many peasants of smaller dwellings went hungry. More and more animals were slaughtered because they could no longer be fed, and bad harvests in 1931 and 1932 crowned the calamity. Grain was remorselessly collected from the worst-hit areas, and some regions with the richest soil became haunted by famine. The crisis was worse than anything since the Civil War, with between 1 to 5 million people dying of starvation. Millions of peasants were organized onto collective farms, but lack of sufficient access to farming equipment and a weak grip on the countryside frustrated these efforts. There was a disconnect between the visions and desires of the peasants in the countryside and the Soviet authorities in the cities. Moscow and the small army it had appointed to the countryside failed to understand the peasant mentality or its traditions. And the peasants did not comprehend the rationality of the reforms, seeing the party as nothing more than invaders who had not only come to abolish the peasant way of life, but to institute a type of slavery from which the first stage of the revolution had liberated them.
This is where you need the buy-in. You need the buy-in of the populace at large, and that includes the rural people, the rural farms or whatever. You need their buy-in as well to the revolution, and you need to be offering them materially uplifting conditions to maintain their support. And it seems like they just really failed in that regard.
The 5-year plan began as a great achievement, but ended in one of the greatest tragedies that left a stain on Soviet history. The tiller of the soil had been collectivized, but it took Soviet agriculture many years to recover from the disaster which accompanied the process. It was not until the later 1930s that the production of grain returned to levels achieved before the revolution, and the fruits of the planned economy would begin to be realized.
Chapter 9, The Revolution in World Perspective.
Marx viewed socialist revolution developing on the foundations of capitalism and bourgeois democracy. But in Russia, this foundation was non-existent. Lenin and the Bolsheviks attempted to build socialism, not in an advanced capitalist country.
Marx is, dude, Marx, I don't know, man. He's like an alien or something. I don't know how he knew all this stuff, how he thought through all this stuff from such a, at such a philosophical level, so far ahead of, ahead of like the times that it would take to, I don't know. It's just insane to me how accurate his understanding of like economics and the world are.
But in an economically and politically backward one. This dilemma could be
He kind of looked like an alien too, am I right? That hair, dude. It's pretty sick though, to be
circumvented if the
honest.
revolution were to become international and socialism was to be introduced in the advanced European countries. The opportunity for such a transition arrived with the First World War, when Russia staged a successful revolution and urged the European proletariat to follow suit. But when European revolution had failed and international socialist revolution was no longer imminent, it became clear to the Bolsheviks that Soviet stability could not be achieved exclusively through the international socialist movement. The strongest economies in the world remained absent of socialist governments. Therefore, in order for Russia to establish itself on the world stage, it needed to become tied to European bourgeois states.
Uh,
Socialism in one country was the logical and pragmatic outcome of these circumstances. It became necessary to strengthen international relations with bourgeois nation-states across the world, and solidify socialism in Russia alone. This gradual entrenchment into the capitalist world system was reflected in a gradual silencing on the question of international socialism. The internal dynamics of the Comintern also slowly changed with socialism in one country, by granting Russia a more privileged socialism as the main priority. Russia saw itself as an exemplar of socialist achievement that ought to be defended and modeled by Western communists. But the communist movements of the West generally continued to hold to the social democratic perspective that saw revolution as achievable through bourgeois democracy, and rejected the vanguardist model of the Bolsheviks. For the West, the International Revolution, conceived by Marx and Lenin as a mass movement of a united European proletariat, still held prominence. Western Marxists could simply not conceive of a leadership role by the weak, backward, and semi-feudal Russian contingent.
That's probably a little racist, but
Much of the Western communist movement rejected the shift towards what it called Stalinism, and sought to build its own path towards socialism. For Western communists, the bourgeois democracy of the capitalist West was preferable to the Stalinist dictatorship from above.
Hey,
Although
we're
this
getting
split
we're getting to our own little dictatorship in American capitalism too, so don't worry. We all get there eventually.
caused great divisions within the Comintern, the colonized nations of the world did in fact continue to view Russia as a model of success. To the colonized nations outside of Europe, Russia was not only a model of success in turning a backward European colony into a modern industrial economy, but also the most important ally in the colonial struggle against Western imperialism. Countries across Latin America, Asia, and Africa took inspiration from the success of the Russian Revolution, and by the 1960s, a surge of socialism through the colonial world proved
Hell
the
yeah.
continued relevance of
Hell yeah.
Marxism-Leninism. To hungry and illiterate masses ready to wage their own struggles, revolution from above was better than no revolution at all. The
And that's why the USSR, like the Soviet Revolution and stuff, or like the Russian Revolution, is a like it's obviously like a complex thing, right? It's not all good, it's not all bad. Some of the good stuff that they did though was provide the inspiration and material support for those revolutionary uh like elements across the world. I think without this, then those elements would not have thrived as much as they did, which threw off the yoke of like colonialism for a while, right? But now that the USSR is firmly in the past, we're starting to see a rise of colonial violence again. So like I don't know if there will be another international socialist movement or something in the future. Uh, but I do see China as kind of like the primary like continuation of this. And at the very least, like at some point when America can't fuck with all these other countries, China, I don't think is going to go around stopping people from having their socialist revolutions. Um, so and maybe hopefully they'll even support it like materially, but we'll see.
Liquidation of the Politburo and expulsion of dissenting voices from the Comintern was a reflection of Stalin's efforts to consolidate a small group of devoted followers around himself. Stalin became a remote and isolated figure, exalted far above ordinary mortals, or indeed his closest colleagues. His words, like Lenin's, were constantly quoted in the press, and their images appeared everywhere. No overt criticism, no expression of dissent appeared any longer in party press or specialist journals. Where such discussions still occurred, they were marked by tasteless and uniform tributes to the leader and celebrations of his mythical achievements. But it would be unfair to depict Stalin as a man moved exclusively by the lust for personal power. He dedicated extraordinary amounts of energy in the transformation of peasant Russia into a modern industrial power, capable of meeting the capitalist powers on equal terms. The need to catch up with the West or overtake the capitalist countries was an obsessive theme and inspired much of Stalin's drab prose. We are 50 or 100 years behind the advanced countries. We must make a good distance in 10 years. Either we do it, or they will crush us.
I don't disagree.
Some argue that without the harsh measures implemented by Stalin, the dramatic transformation of Russia would have been impossible, and that it was therefore necessary to tolerate his forceful leadership and unwelcome idiosyncrasies. The fact that this was a revolution from above, that placed the heaviest burdens on the very classes which were declared its beneficiaries, did not seriously disturb the picture. Enthusiasm for the great turn and implementing the grand design engulfed many within the party and often came at the expense of other considerations. Since his death, the fluctuations in Stalin's reputation in the eyes of his compatriots seem to reflect confused and conflicting emotions of admiration and shame. Comparisons to Peter the Great, a man of formidable energy and extreme ferocity, have often been invoked. Stalin revived and outdid the worst brutalities of earlier czars. Yet his achievements in borrowing from the West, forcing modernity onto a backward peasant economy, and giving Russia a place among the European powers oblige many to fully acknowledge the greatness of this leader. When Stalin took power of the Bolshevik Party upon Lenin's death, Russia was a backward, semi-feudal agrarian society, and by the end of World War II in 1945, Russia was a world power, finally capable of meeting the economic and military power of the
Whether it was this, like the Russian Revolution, or if I think that it did help overall, probably, for accelerating their advancement into an industrialized nation. I do. I think that they would have been a lot slower to do so if they didn't have like Lenin and Stalin and like the USSR as like and like the Russian Revolution as the leading leading them into the future. Stalin, like yeah, he's a complex figure. He's been rewritten generally by the West to just be evil, pure evil, whatever, right? Um, and I don't think that's the case. Like I honestly I don't really see him as evil at all, really. But like I do see failures, obviously, by him that led to bad outcomes and whatnot. But that happens all the time throughout history. So yeah, I don't know. That's kind of my thoughts on him.
The West. Stalin was a despot, but he used his despotism to force Russia out of the Dark Ages. Progress of the revolution was continually halted and was broken by a series of setbacks and calamities, both avoidable and unavoidable. The ravages and shortages caused by World War I, the Civil War, and forced industrialization policies made their mark, both material and moral, on the consciousness of Soviet life, its people, and its leaders. But this does not mean that no advance had been made at all towards the exalted idea of socialism. Achievements of global significance had been made by the Russian Revolution and the Soviet Union. Lenin's Bolshevik Party embodied the practice of revolutionary theory, and since 1917 has proven to be the most reliable means for working and poor people to capture state power. The success of the revolution was more deeply ingrained with the unlikely victory of the Civil War, which defeated an invasion of far more developed and sophisticated Allied forces. The subsequent establishment of the Comintern solidified socialism as an international tendency and instantly became the most important institution of international socialist solidarity.
Well,
The planned economy, dictated largely by socialism in one country, imposed a heavy cost to the worker and peasant, but was hugely successful in meeting Stalin's goal to catch up with the West. Industrialization efforts put Russia on a path to modernization, which ultimately not only secured the existence of the Soviet Union, but expanded its influence across the world. As the planned economy successfully modernized Russian industry, it provided an alternative to the market economy and inspired many social reforms across the world, including in the capitalist West.
yeah, I think that's the best thing that came out of it is the just general uh general acknowledgement or like the distribution of like socialism as an idea and purveying that as like an alternative to capitalism. Um, and like I think that at this point it like obviously is that idea is never going to go away and will only grow as the contradictions in capitalism worsen. Um, so yeah, I think that's probably one of the greatest things about the Russian Revolution and the USSR in general.
But perhaps most importantly, defeat of the Nazi invaders during World War II would have simply been
Yeah,
impossible
exactly.
without the rapid industrialization efforts of the planned economy.
It's all Russia. If Russia was the only thing basically that defeated the Nazis. If Russia did not do this, industrialize this quickly, and contribute so many of their people and like materials or whatever to the war against the Nazis. I won't say that they would have won one, but they would have like continued their reign significantly longer.
On the 50th anniversary of the revolution in 1967, the fruits of industrialization, mechanization, and long term planning had matured, and account could be made of the drastic magnitude of changes that advanced Soviet society for the better. While much remained primitive by Western measurements, standards of living for the Soviet people substantially improved. Adult literacy climbed to virtually 100%.
That's
Life
sick.
expectancy more than doubled, from 32 years to
That's also sick.
68 years, and infant mortality dropped from
That's
23%
also
to
sick, man. I mean,
3%.
if you look at how quickly that happened, like that is insane. I mean, and our like let's not get talking about America's infant mortality. I think it's on the up and up right now.
The historic cycle of famine, which had afflicted Russia before and after the October Revolution, had officially been put to an end. The population grew from 145 million to 250 million, and the proportion of people living in towns increased from 20
Yeah,
to
but
50.
I mean, but how many hypothetical people weren't born then? Socialism, communism killed 100 million people, hypothetical people who weren't born because they became communist guys. Sorry, I'm sorry to tell you.
50%. Many of these new city dwellers were the grandchildren of peasants and serfs who could hardly fail to recognize what the revolution had done for them. The record of the Russian Revolution is flawed and ambiguous, but it has been the source of more profound and more lasting repercussions throughout the world than any other historical event of modern times.
Well, I guess that's about it. Okay, that was another Red Pin video on the Russian Revolution. I feel like I learned a lot. You know, I think that it's the reverberations of that are still felt to this day. Um, if you look through like how China like organizes its society and like what they learned from the USSR and stuff, like you can still see elements of this, and they learned from the mistakes of the USSR as well, as a part of, you know, their rapid industrialization or whatever. Um, all of the decolonial efforts that came after, or like that came during and after, and that the USSR supported. Incredible. And then, also the obvious shortcomings and failures of it. But every revolution has that to an extent. You can't make it, from point A to point C without going through point B. So, uh, yeah, I thought that was a good video. I hope anybody who's out there listening, watching, whatever, I hope you learned something too. You know, we're we're all we're all just trying to understand this crazy world that we live in. So, thank you anybody who's watching. You know, feel free to stop by, leave some chats, whatever, if you ever want to. I hope you have a good rest of your day. Um, that's about it. Bye bye.